The office is changing. Gone are the days of the soulless maze of cubicles where you can't find your way out of, as we discussed earlier. Today's offices need to be slick, they need to be sexy, they need to draw people in, because people now have more choices than ever about where they work. So the big question is, how do we optimize the offices that we have today for the future? But with that in mind, I feel like you can't really get into a discussion about optimizing workspaces until you actually discuss the big point, which is, what is the value of the office?
Historically, there were places that we kept all our equipment that we used to do our work. I think the patterns that we've seen over COVID and post-COVID a realization that was something that was in train already. We all had mobile technology. So actually the reason to come into the office wasn't to go and sit by our typewriter or a piece of heavy equipment. Actually, this has been happening for a long time. And I think some companies had already figured this out a few years ago, that actually to motivate people to be their best productive self, they need to do something different with the workplace.
My role is not just to be somebody that sits and does property law all day. My role is also to be part of a wider community in the office. It's about mentoring and training people. It's about working in, property development. You're often working with people from 8 or 10 different teams. So it's having that collaboration. It's having the buzz of being in a place that's energetic. It's a place where opportunities are actually created, quite often not in a set piece, but quite often in a sort of semi-random sort of way. But you've got to create that environment.
So how do you get them to come in when fundamentally they might not want to, especially sort of more younger people who haven't necessarily sort of developed that kind of approach towards what the benefit of the office is? And I think now it's becoming the value of the office is in a lot more, like you guys have said, it's a lot more about culture and skill set training.
Culture is everything, you know. I, as the head of office of 150 odd people in Manchester over COVID, it was fatiguing, it was difficult. You cannot curate a culture of a business and an office remotely over that period. You have to physically interact. And whilst there's some thinking that says you can, say it, it's hard. It's really hard, especially when you've got people doing different things. So culture is everything about workspace. But the biggest thing I've learned over the last 4 years about the value of the office space is every single business is different. We're all very focused, delivery driven, and we want these one size fits all solutions. What's right for an outward bound sales call center is very different for a professional services business about how they do that. And that's where businesses like TSK are really important, because you come in and you address what are the needs for those individual businesses and how do we react to that, because there's a spectrum of hybrid working, and as a business you've got to find where you want to go forwards with that on that spectrum.
I think we all understand the value of our homes in the way that we've grown up, had families, and how those homes have changed and supported us. The same has to be true of the workplace. And I think ultimately workplaces are becoming fundamentally human, and people feel that they can be themselves in them for the first time. These are our homes where we nurture and grow our organisations. Then that's really the role of the office.
Within our organisations, there's people with very, very different dynamics depending on your job role, your personality, your seniority. I personally find our offices quite noisy and distracting, but actually there's members of my own team who think the office is just this oasis of peace and quiet. So we're all reacting to the same space in different ways. And the fit out we've done together down in Cardiff, it's about trying to find enough of a platform for all the common things and the culture things, while having enough varied space for people to then make those individual choices.
I think we just need to focus on the beverage piece first, and it's such an evocative subject. And there's right at the core of that is the willingness of that business to spend some money on their people, and it plays into this bigger conversation, doesn't it, about cost and value. I know that if I get a free cup of coffee, that gets me off to a good start. If it's a good cup of coffee, and if it's an excellent cup of coffee, that changes my frame of mind. But it's actually that sense of generosity and investment in people, which is separate from the coffee. It's about how you treat your people.
The first thing must be your sense of arrival, which is the first and last 5%. That's probably your biggest impression in terms of hospitality. And again, notoriously has been terrible. You've had people on low desks with suits, or not really saying hello and not really being very responsive. That's obviously fundamentally changed as offices become more like hotels, and you want to be able to pick up as a tenant and press 0 and speak to someone who can fix a problem. So every building's relatively unique. I think with hospitality though, what you fundamentally have to come to is the member journey or the customer journey, and it has to be really well packed together, and it starts and finishes at that arrival area.
Because if you think one of the things about bringing people to a workplace is you're trying to bring people to one place to do great things together. If you took what we did this morning, where great hospitality, we had a coffee, it broke down all the barriers between us all to have a really good conversation. And I think often people miss the social dynamics of actually how do you host, how do you create coffee, how do you get people to talk, contribute and share. And the sense of ease that we've all had and the quality of discussion we've had is because of that foundation. And that's really where hospitality, coffee sit as part of that social dynamic.
So I think it's a scenario-based way to think about how to optimize the future of that. And based on that is using that insight, is right-sizing your real estate based on those future scenarios.
I think you've got to have a pretty clear understanding about how your team employees are going to use the space, providing optimum flexibility, which requires you then probably to think about what are the sort of things that you don't need 100% of the time. And then you've got to ask your landlord whether or not they're going to provide those amenities that you might use very occasionally on a pay-as-you-use basis. And if they're not, is that building really for you?
I was going to say recognising that there is no one right answer, and that right answer will change over time as well, and that keeping that flexibility and treating people like grown-ups and giving them choice in how they're going to use the space for the task at hand that day.
I think it's constantly asking, what do we need to be effective and to be able to deliver for our clients? Because as a professional services organisation, that's what we exist for. And without being able to deliver for the clients, we don't have a business. But also, what do we need from, as occupiers and the different tiers of occupiers?
So I'm going to have 2 points. One, create stakeholders, because in the process of it, refurbishment, relocation, create stakeholders as early as possible, because stakeholdings lead to emotional investment. Once you've got emotional investment, you've got an army of people who are a cohort of people to drive that cultural change and all of those things you want to achieve. 2, choose your partners really carefully, whether it's a flex operator, whether it's a landlord. Do your DD. Don't just assume that a landlord owns a building and is going to operate it brilliantly.
That's such an interesting point, in that landlords are so much more involved now. Going back to when I started working in this industry, the landlord was this remote figure you never saw. You just sent them a big check every quarter day. Whereas so many of our landlords now I see regularly. I go out for lunch with them, we have a glass of wine together. They are emotionally invested in the building themselves, rather than seeing it as some abstract investment.
I think that, as someone described it, the imperialist model of the landlord has sort of slightly it was actually a landlord that told me that. Because obviously, you're right, it was short term. It was like, put it up, fill it, sell it, do it again, but bigger, and make loads of money. And I think now, you're right, it is about the relationship that you build with them. And that's why I think you'll see more and more pockets of areas or nodes or whatever you want pop up, and it won't just be about spinning fields or Peter Square or whatever it is. I think more and more, because more and more developer landlords these days are looking at going, how are we going to make this whole area? It's not just about the building, right? But who's going to provide the F&B there? Who's going to provide the well-being there? How are we going to work out our sustainability strategy on that area there? And what has this building got to do? And when we think about it in 10 years' time, that building has got to do something a bit different to that building. Otherwise, we're going to have cannibalize it. And there's a lot more kind of place-making strategy, ESG focus, that's going on, because you're 100% right, because they're thinking like long term.
Is there any other kind of quick fix?
One of the things that was so nice when we moved into New Bailey, my LinkedIn was full of pictures our people were taking of them sat outside with their laptop, because the Wi-Fi reached to the balcony as well. So obviously it's Manchester, we only do that like a week a year. But for that week a year, everyone loves that.
It's funny how everybody talks about activating space these days. When you're on a tour, whether it be a roof terrace, an atrium, everybody talks about activating the space, which is, as language always moves on, doesn't it? But it's interesting how these spaces aren't just passive spaces that you now walk through and do. You expect it to be, curated around you.
I think the flexibility point that we've both touched on, to give a humorous example, My very first job when I was a 16-year-old Saturday girl in a local law firm, I had an electric typewriter. And since then, and I'm not that old, but I've now got a touchscreen laptop, I've got an iPhone that does everything. We don't know what we don't know that's coming in that next period of time. And that's why that flexibility piece is so important.